The Apollo era, to the American public, was defined by noise. The roar of the Saturn V rocket, the crackle of mission control transmissions, and the triumphant loud words spoken on the lunar surface. Yet for the archivists and historians who inherited the raw data, the true story of the space race resides in the vast, almost incomprehensible silence of the institutional record. Millions of pages of budgets, internal memos, and technical specifications, most of which are utterly devoid of drama. It is in this ocean of functional, bureaucratic boringness that a secret can survive, protected not by classification, but by sheer volume. Our focus begins deep within the Johnson Space Center's restricted archives, in a digital repository labeled simply Declassified Budget Oversight, Unsuccessful Pre-Apollo Projects, 1965 to 1969. The search for the anomaly was undertaken by Dr. Elias Vance, a descendant of our recurring scholarly family, now specializing in the economic history of Cold War science. Dr. Vance was engaged in the laborious, solitary task of reconstructing the exact financial overhead of the Apollo program, a pursuit requiring the patience of a saint and an eye for the smallest deviation in standardized accounting practice. This was a process measured in months, not minutes, the quintessential slow burn of historical inquiry. The file that finally yielded the secret was named Project Echo Zero, Lunar Acoustical Survey, Final Closeout, 1968. Project Echo Zero was officially listed as a minor, 3-month study intended to analyze the structural viability of potential lunar landers by measuring ambient acoustic interference during launch simulations. The total budget was minuscule, particularly when set against the billions pouring into Apollo, a mere $45,219. The project was noted as terminated due to scheduling conflicts with main lunar hardware integration, a perfectly neat, unremarkable failure. However, the budget details within the Echo Zero file presented a zero-sum anomaly, a financial contradiction that, to an experienced auditor like Dr. Vance, screamed of deliberate obfuscation. The anomaly lay not in the total expense, but in the internal balancing. Category, allocated cost, actual expense, variance. Personnel and overhead, $15,000, $15,000, 0. Ground testing and data, $10,219, $10,219, 0. Specialized equipment, acoustics, $20,000, $20,000, 0. Every line item, down to the last penny, showed a perfect, unassailable zero variance. In the chaotic world of 1960s NASA budgeting, where cost overruns were the norm and accounting was notoriously imprecise, a project of this complexity achieving absolute zero variance was statistically impossible. It suggested not genuine accounting, but a deliberate, careful backfill, a quiet erasure of the real costs to make the final ledger appear inconsequential. The most suspicious line item was the $20,000 for specialized equipment. This amount, while modest, was allocated entirely to a single purchase order logged under the name Cryogenic Isolation Unit, Model AS-1. The description was vague, and crucially, there were no accompanying maintenance logs, disposal receipts, or public technical specifications attached to the purchase. The file simply stated the unit was integrated and consumed during the testing phase. The real questions that the zero-sum file quietly raised were not about money, but about priority. The overkill cost, $20,000 in 1968, represented a significant expenditure, enough to purchase the most sophisticated acoustic sensors available. Why was such high-grade specialized equipment necessary for a routine launch simulation study that was quickly canceled? the premature termination. The project was shut down just 3 months into a planned 6-month study. In the Apollo urgency, why waste the $20,000 equipment purchase instead of simply reallocating it to another project? The neat closure suggested the mission was complete, not canceled. The cryogenic necessity. Why did an acoustic study require a cryogenic isolation unit? Cryogenics are used to cool components to near absolute zero, primarily to reduce thermal noise and increase the sensitivity of sensors designed to detect ultra-low energy phenomena, signals far quieter than the ambient noise of a launch simulation. Dr. Vance, leaning back from the cold glare of the digital ledger, realized that Project Echo Zero was not about launch acoustics, it was about silence. The entire budget was a cover, meticulously designed to spend exactly $20,000 on a piece of equipment that was, for political or strategic reasons, never meant to be accounted for after use. The zero-sum anomaly was the perfect camouflage. The only way to hide the real destination of the $20,000 piece of equipment was to make it financially disappear into a perfectly balanced, failed study. Further cross-referencing of contemporaneous launch manifests revealed a final compelling piece of evidence. During the preparation for an early unmanned Apollo test flight, Apollo 5, 1968, a small, irregularly shaped ballast package was noted in the cargo manifest. It was listed merely as auxiliary structural stabilization mass. The estimated weight and volume of this ballast package aligned precisely with the estimated size of the cryogenic isolation unit model AS-1. The implication was profound. The unit was never consumed in a test bay. It was silently integrated into the Apollo hardware and launched into space, disguised as a necessary structural counterweight. The zero-sum file proved that NASA spent a significant sum to hide a delicate, specialized sensor designed for detecting unnatural quiet, a sensor launched on a mission that achieved lunar orbit. The historical silence around Echo Zero was deliberate, and its true purpose was not a terrestrial study, but the mapping of lunar silence itself, seeking an anomaly that existed far beyond the clamor of the Cold War. The architects of this deception, the original signatories on the equipment purchase order, were not rocket scientists or astronauts, but specialists in the subtle art of acoustics and non-detection, suggesting a mission obsessed with the whispers, not the roars, of space. The investigation must now turn to the architects of quietude and the unusual science they pursued. The discovery of the zero-sum anomaly, the meticulously balanced budget for Project Echo Zero, and the disappearance of the specialized cryogenic isolation unit, model AS-1, shifted the historical inquiry from finance to personnel. The true nature of this clandestine mission lay not in the high-profile laboratories of jet propulsion, but in the subdued, often overlooked departments of applied acoustics and vibration analysis. These were the disciplines of scientists trained to focus on what wasn't there, the absence of sound, the perfect null. These were the architects of quietude. Dr. Elias Vance's methodical search through NASA personnel records looking for the signatories on the Echo Zero purchase order yielded names that were almost entirely absent from the triumphant histories of the space race. They were not Wernher von Braun's engineers or Chris Kraft's flight directors. They were specialists in signal-to-noise ratio, SNR, a field that seeks to maximize the detection of the faintest signal by minimizing the surrounding environmental interference. Two figures emerged as the intellectual and logistical architects of Echo Zero. The theoretical architect, Dr. Alistair Finch. Dr. Alistair Finch, another recurrence of the name in the historical record, perhaps suggesting a familial predisposition for discreet scholarship, was a brilliant but obscure professor of terrestrial and atmospheric acoustics at a California university. He was drawn into the NASA orbit not for his knowledge of rocketry, but for his doctoral work, which focused on the near-impossible task of filtering out all acoustic interference, thermal, seismic, and electromagnetic, to measure the absolute ambient noise floor of the Earth itself. Finch's thesis was rooted in a profound philosophical idea that true silence is a physical constant, and that any deviation from that constant, however minute, represents an external influence. He was obsessed with the idea that the universe, in its vastness, must possess a specific, measurable tone of fundamental quietude. His pitch to NASA, buried in a high-level security memo, retrospectively declassified and stripped of all technical jargon, was simple and startling. Apollo provided the perfect, unique opportunity to measure the acoustic null of the Moon. Shielded by the Earth and utterly lacking atmosphere, the lunar far side offered a natural environment where terrestrial noise pollution and atmospheric interference would cease. If there was any unnatural or constant energy signature in the solar system, the Moon was the best place to find it, provided you had a sensor quiet enough to listen. Finch was the intellectual force behind the requirement for the cryogenic isolation unit. He knew that to achieve the necessary sensitivity, the sensor itself had to be cooled close to absolute zero, eliminating its own thermal noise, a form of engineering purity that mirrored the scientific quest for absolute quiet. The operational counterpart was Mr. Samuel Pierce, a low-ranking but highly trusted logistics supervisor from the Air Force Materials Command. Pierce possessed the practical knowledge of how to make things disappear into a larger, functional system. Pierce was the reason the cryogenic unit was disguised as auxiliary structural stabilization mass in the Apollo 5 manifest. He expertly navigated the bureaucratic maze, ensuring that the sensor was mounted not in a high-traffic science bay, but deep within the service module's empty ballast space, where it would be shielded by layers of hardware and ignored by technicians focused on the main objectives. Pierce was the architect of the quiet convoys in the organizational sense. He ensured that the sensor, once built, moved through the NASA system not with military escort, but with the anonymity of common freight, a slow, unexciting transfer from the acoustic lab to the rocket integration bay, masked by thousands of routine parts movements. His commitment was to unexciting efficiency, making the transfer so dull and predictable that no security measure was ever triggered. The science of listening. The mission of Echo Zero was not about space exploration in the conventional sense. It was about pure detection. The specialized acoustic equipment, now residing silently in the ballast bay of Apollo 5, was essentially a passive receiver, a device designed to listen for ultra-low frequency vibrations, signals below 1 Hertz. Conventional sensors, designed to detect seismic activity, thermal radiation, or radio waves. Echo Zero sensor, AS1, designed to detect consistent, non-seismic, periodic oscillation in the ambient energy field of the Moon. Finch hypothesized that any artificial or technologically advanced operation from any source, terrestrial or otherwise, would leave a faint, periodic footprint in the energy field, a subtle, periodic hum that conventional noise filters would dismiss as random interference. The cryogenic isolation unit was the final, profound expression of this obsession with silence. By cooling the sensor components, the engineers silenced the sensor itself, effectively lowering the ear's internal noise floor to an almost impossible minimum. The mission was predicated on the understanding that the most significant discovery might be the most quiet. The deployment was as quiet as the preparation. During Apollo 5's early orbit phase, the AS-1 unit received a coded, non-verbal instruction from a dedicated ground station in the California desert, a station that logged its entire activity under the cover of routine meteorological tracking. The unit was activated, spending its brief 3-day lifespan silently recording the acoustic null of lunar space and the far side before the service module was intentionally burned up in the atmosphere. The true architects were thus men of precise, intellectual boredom. They valued meticulous accounting, creating the zero-sum file, disciplined logistics, the slow, quiet transfer, and the pursuit of acoustic purity, the cryogenic sensor. Their success hinged on the premise that in a chaotic, loud environment like the space race, the best place to hide the biggest secret was in the quietest project. The next stage of the investigation must now turn its focus to the silent, digitized records, the raw data tapes themselves, and the specific, troubling phantom signal that Dr. Finch's specialized equipment was designed to capture in the deafening vacuum of space.
The meticulous deception woven by the architects of quietude, Dr. Alistair Finch and Mr. Samuel Pierce, culminated in the placement of the cryogenic isolation unit, model AS-1, aboard the Apollo 5 service module. This unit, disguised on the manifest as mere auxiliary structural stabilization mask, was the true heart of Project Echo Zero. It was the unseen cargo, a payload of profound intellectual significance deliberately buried within the metallic chaos of the early space race. This microlab, costing $20,000 in 1968, an amount meticulously made to vanish via the zero-sum anomaly, was not designed to take pictures or scoop lunar soil. It was designed to listen to the void with an intensity previously unknown to the American space program. The engineering of silence. The AS-1 unit represented a pinnacle of clandestine engineering. Its purpose was singular: to lower the thermal and electronic noise floor to such an extreme minimum that the sensor could detect energy signatures far fainter than the average background static of the cosmos. The shell. The microlab was housed in a compact, dense titanium cylinder engineered to be seismically decoupled from the main structure of the service module. This mechanical isolation ensured that the vibrations from the spacecraft itself, the hum of the wiring, the temperature fluctuations of the metal, did not contaminate the sensor. The cryogenic necessity. The core components of the sensor were bathed in liquid helium within the isolation unit. This supercooling was not merely for thermal management, it was an act of acoustic purity. By reducing the sensor's operating temperature to near absolute zero, 4 Kelvin, the thermal agitation of the electrons, known as Johnson noise or thermal noise, was virtually eliminated. This silence of the sensor itself was the prerequisite for hearing the subtle sounds of the universe. The sensor. The actual sensor was a marvel of miniaturization, an ultra-low frequency, ULF, piezoelectric crystal array. Piezoelectric sensors convert mechanical stress, vibration, or pressure into an electrical signal. Unlike radio antennas, which listen to the air waves, or seismometers, which listen to ground movement, this crystal array was tuned to the ambient field, the subtle, periodic distortions of the localized electromagnetic field between 0.1 Hz and 1 Hz. This frequency range is typically dismissed as either seismic noise or instrumental drift in most space experiments. Dr. Finch theorized that any large, stable energy source, natural or technological, operating on the lunar surface or beneath it, would create a minute rhythmic oscillation in the local field that would manifest in this ULF range. The microlab was effectively a deep space tuning fork, listening for a single quiet tone in the deafening vacuum. The lunar deployment. The moment of deployment was as uneventful as planned. Apollo 5, carrying the unseen cargo, achieved its scheduled orbital test objectives.
While mission control focused on the primary engine burns, the dedicated silent ground station in the California desert, still disguised as a meteorological research facility, issued the brief encrypted command. The AS-1 unit did not require complex deployment arms or robotics. The titanium shell simply vented a heat-shielding material that allowed the sensor array to passively interface with the exterior of the service module. For 3 days, as Apollo 5 circled the moon, the microlab performed its solitary mission. It was not transmitting continuous data. That would have attracted notice. Instead, it was performing a function known as burst logging. The unit was programmed to record only when a specific, sustained criterion was met, a consistent ULF oscillation exceeding the pre-established noise floor for a minimum of 60 continuous seconds. This was the ultimate filter. Ignore the static, ignore the noise of the spacecraft, and record only the sustained, non-random whisper of the lunar environment. The sheer volume of data recorded was small, only a few minutes of log time across the entire 3-day mission. This minuscule dataset was then compressed and stored on a specialized radiation-hardened magnetic tape loop inside the microlab. The low-bandwidth transmission of this minimal log data, disguised within the general telemetry stream of auxiliary engineering diagnostics, was the final logistical masterpiece of Mr. Samuel Pierce. It was a tiny drop of pure information slipped into a river of noise. The acquisition of the tape. The existence of the data was hidden immediately. The receiving station, following strict pre-arranged protocols, logged the transmission as routine structural resonance data and immediately transferred the raw magnetic tape, the only physical proof of the mission's success, not to NASA's main data center, but to a secure off-site government facility housed under the aegis of the National Bureau of Standards, NBS, a facility dedicated to precise measurement and calibration, an ideal cover for a mission centered on measuring absolute quiet. This transfer of the tape, a small nondescript spool of magnetic material containing the silent echoes of the moon, was the true climax of the clandestine operation. It was a transfer marked by profound, successful boredom. The file was logged, filed, and effectively disappeared into the silence of bureaucratic procedure, awaiting the analytical eye of Dr. Finch. The narrative now leaves the silence of the archive and the engineering lab and moves to the ultimate confrontation, the analysis of the data itself. The microlab, the unseen cargo, had done its job perfectly. It had captured the most unusual sound in lunar space, and now that sound resided on a magnetic tape, awaiting a patient hand to press play and reveal the phantom signal hidden in the vacuum. The ultimate destiny of Project Echo Zero lay not in the launch pad's roar or the high orbit's cold silence, but in a small, windowless sound laboratory deep within the National Bureau of Standards, NBS, facility in Boulder, Colorado. This room, designed for acoustic purity, was where the raw magnetic tape, the sole physical remnant of the unseen cargo's 3-day lunar vigil, was finally brought for analysis. The atmosphere was one of profound intellectual stillness, the perfect counterpoint to the chaotic historical moment of 1968. Dr. Alastair Finch, the theoretical architect, was the only scientist present during the initial playback. He was not looking for dramatic noise. He was looking for a pattern that defied the noise floor of the universe. The analysis demanded isolation, precision, and the patience to sift through hours of recorded nothingness. The tape, labeled generically as Auxiliary Structural Resonance Log Apollo 5, was loaded onto a specialized vacuum-sealed playback unit. This unit was crucial. It filtered out all terrestrial electromagnetic and thermal interference, allowing Dr. Finch to hear only the data transmitted from the long-vanished cryogenic isolation unit, model AS-1. The audition of silence. The initial playback was, as expected, an overwhelming wash of acoustic null, the sound of profound vacuum. This was the target of the mission, the absolute ambient noise of lunar space. The background sound was cold, consistent, and featureless, a tone that confirmed the success of the cryogenic isolation unit in dampening its own thermal noise. For the first 26 hours of the log, the tape recorded exactly what was anticipated, the random, chaotic energy signature of cosmic background radiation and the occasional minute ping of a micrometeoroid impacting the service module, sounds easily dismissed and categorized as ambient interference. Dr. Finch logged these events with the meticulous, monotonous patience expected of a true architect of quietude. But then, at the 3-day mark of the recording, corresponding to the final hours of the service module's useful life before re-entry, the background silence was subtly, yet profoundly, altered. It was not a loud noise, nor a recognizable burst of radio chatter. It was the phantom signal. The signal manifested as a consistent, periodic, ultra-low frequency oscillation, registered primarily within the 0.3 Hz to 0.4 Hz range. This frequency is far below the threshold of human hearing. It was discernible only through the visual tracing on a hypersensitive oscilloscope and through the resulting subtle thrum felt in the isolation lab's structure, a vibration so minor that it would have been dismissed as environmental noise anywhere else. The oscillation possessed two chilling characteristics that immediately elevated it from mundane interference to an extraordinary anomaly. Non-seismic consistency. If the signal were the result of lunar geological activity, a moonquake, it would exhibit chaotic decay and varying amplitudes. The phantom signal, however, possessed an unnervingly stable, constant amplitude and a perfectly periodic rhythm. It was a steady pulse, a beat that did not falter, suggesting a sustained energy source that was not dissipating through rock. Lack of Doppler shift. As the Apollo service module orbited the Moon, any fixed source on the lunar surface should have exhibited a Doppler shift, a change in frequency as the module moved closer to and then away from the source. The phantom signal showed zero discernible Doppler shift. This implied that the source was either immense, diffuse, or positioned at a highly specific equidistant point relative to the orbital path, a logistical impossibility for a fixed surface object. Dr. Finch spent the next 48 hours isolating, filtering, and cross-correlating the 0.3 Hz thrum against every known terrestrial and solar phenomenon, geomagnetic storms, industrial vibrations, even the subtle rhythmic sway of the Earth itself. The signal did not match any known source. It was an unlisted, constant tone originating from the silent lunar environment. The cartography of absence. The true significance of the signal emerged when Dr. Finch plotted the precise orbital location of Apollo 5 at the moments the AS-1 unit logged the burst record. The sensor was programmed only to record when the signal was strongest and sustained. The analysis revealed a powerful yet contradictory geographical clue. The signal only appeared when the service module was passing over the lunar far side, the hemisphere permanently shielded from the Earth. This shielding confirmed that the signal was not terrestrial radio interference or electromagnetic leakage. Furthermore, the periods of strongest sustained detection occurred when the module's trajectory placed the phantom signal's source within a small, specific region of the far side, a region defined by a high concentration of ancient deep impact basins and a profound absence of any human or visible natural feature.
This area was not a landing site, not a target of geological study, and not a focus of Cold War attention. It was, in every sense of the word, a blank spot on the cartography of the Moon. The reason for the lack of Doppler shift suddenly gained a chilling possible explanation. The source was not simply on the far side, but was radiating from a position that maintained an almost perfect geometrical neutrality, relative to the polar orbit, suggesting a deep, stable point of immense, constant energy. The anomaly in the tapes. The final decisive confrontation with the phantom signal came during the acoustic playback itself. Dr. Finch, listening to the pure, filtered tape through professional headphones, heard the ultra-low frequency signal translated into the faintest, most unsettling metronome beat. It was a rhythm, slow, steady, and utterly perfect, 0.35 oscillations per second. This beat was the intellectual catastrophe of Project Echo Zero. It suggested a degree of stability and persistence that defied known planetary physics and pointed towards a structured, sustained energy flow. The architects of quietude had succeeded far beyond their official mandate. They hadn't just mapped lunar silence, they had captured the subtle, enduring pulse of the far side, a pulse that was mathematically perfect and entirely unnatural. The tapes held the ultimate historical secret, that the vacuum of space, far from being silent, contained a quiet, rhythmic hum, a hum that neither the US nor the Soviet Union officially expected or prepared for. The existence of this steady, organized tone in the deepest silence was too destabilizing, too profound for the geopolitics of 1968. The silence of the NBS lab where Dr. Finch listened alone to the rhythmic heartbeat of the void became the final necessary shield for the phantom signal. The mission was a success, but the secret had to remain buried, lest the noise of the Cold War escalate to cosmic proportions.
The rhythmic, unnervingly perfect 0.35 Hz oscillation, the phantom signal, isolated by Dr. Alistair Finch from the silent tapes of Project Echo Zero, served as the ultimate compass point. The signal had successfully navigated the 3 days of orbiting the Moon and the decades of bureaucratic obscurity, pointing the historian's inquiry toward the most profound physical silence in the solar system, the lunar far side. This was the Moon's vast, perpetually unseen hemisphere, shielded by the lunar mass from the electromagnetic and radio chatter of Earth. To the public, the far side was an aesthetic novelty. To the architects of quietude, it was the only pristine canvas left for acoustic analysis. Dr. Finch's task was to take the temporal data of the sustained signal and perform a cartography of absence, mapping a sound to a region of profound geological and historical emptiness. The geometry of the null zone. The signal's most defining characteristic, the absence of Doppler shift, provided the primary geometric constraint. For a satellite in a stable orbit, the frequency of a signal from a stationary surface source should fluctuate predictably, increasing as the satellite approaches, blue shift, and decreasing as it moves away, red shift. The 0.35 Hz thrum, however, remained unnervingly constant during its log time. Dr. Finch used computational models, feeding in the exact orbital mechanics of Apollo 5 and reversing the math. A lack of Doppler shift implies that the source must be positioned at the midpoint of the orbit's chord, maintaining near-perfect perpendicularity to the service module's velocity vector throughout the burst log period. This calculation narrowed the source down to an extremely precise, small area on the lunar far side, specifically positioned near the equator, where the Earth's tidal locking minimized gravitational anomalies.
This was a zone of profound geological indifference, away from the dramatic mountains and Maria that captivated NASA's public efforts. The landscape of the unknown. This region, defined by its acoustic properties rather than its visual ones, became known internally to Dr. Finch as the null zone. He overlaid the calculated coordinates onto the most detailed topographical maps available from the unmanned lunar orbiter missions of the mid-1960s. The null zone corresponded to an ancient, heavily cratered region containing portions of the Hertzsprung and Mendel-Rydberg basins. The visual analysis of this area revealed nothing remarkable. It was, physically, the quintessential lunar surface: gray regolith, shallow craters, and a profound visible lack of any human or natural feature that could account for a stable, sustained energy source. It was an environment defined by what was not there. No volcanic activity. The region was geologically cold, ruling out natural thermal sources. No tectonic stress. The seismic maps were silent, ruling out steady moonquakes or pressure decay. No known metallic deposits. The magnetosurveys showed only expected residual magnetization, ruling out a simple immense iron core or metallic vein. The signal was originating from a location whose material and thermal silence should have been absolute, yet it was pulsing with a rhythmic, ordered energy. The cartography of absence revealed a profound paradox, a sustained beat of energy emanating from a place of geological deadness. The whisper of technology. Dr. Finch was forced to confront the most profound implications of the signal's mathematical purity. A perfectly periodic rhythm of 0.35 Hertz, or 0.35 cycles per second, suggests a structured, synchronized, non-natural source. Planetary processes, even volcanic ones, are chaotic and show decay. The constancy of the phantom signal pointed toward an engineered process. Could it be Soviet? The analysis of known Soviet lunar payloads and orbital paths from 1968 showed no corresponding assets in that region. Furthermore, if it were a Soviet energy operation, its purpose would be to transmit data, creating a high-frequency radio signature. The 0.35 Hz signal was ultra-low frequency, the sound of an engine running at a profoundly slow, steady cycle, not the sound of data being sent. The ultra-low frequency nature of the signal reinforced the architects of Quietude's original suspicion. They were not listening for conversation. They were listening for the power source, the low, fundamental hum of an energy system that was designed to operate in absolute silence. This led Dr. Finch to the most unsettling conclusion. The source was engineered, but its engineering was protected by a silence so complete that it was only detectable by a sensor cooled to near absolute zero. The signal was designed to be ignored by every single conventional sensor in the Cold War arsenals of both superpowers. The signal itself was a secondary form of camouflage. The historical confrontation. The cartography of absence thus became a historical confrontation with what the space race deliberately failed to look for. The vast majority of lunar exploration was focused on geological origins and the visible signs of life or resources. Project Echo Zero, in contrast, was designed to investigate the possibility of an existing, sustained external presence operating within the protective silence of the lunar far side. Dr. Finch realized that the silence surrounding the mission was likely the result of this initial finding. The discovery of a mathematically ordered, non-terrestrial energy source on the Moon in 1968 would not have been a scientific triumph. It would have been a catastrophic, destabilizing political event, immediately escalating the Cold War to a cosmic scale. The data had successfully located the source. The 0.35 Hz oscillation confirmed the sustained operation of a deep, silent system within the null zone of the far side. But the information was too heavy, too dangerous, and too quiet to be heard by the world. The silence of the null zone had successfully protected its secret for millennia, only to be briefly penetrated by the silent, cryogenic ear of the AS1 unit. The subsequent destruction of Project Echo Zero and the deliberate obfuscation of the file were not arbitrary. They were a necessary, immediate quarantine of the most profound secret acquired during the Apollo era. The historical narrative now pivots to the question of who imposed this quarantine and the immense geopolitical pressure exerted to ensure the continued doctrine of obscurity.
The successful retrieval of the 0.35 Hz phantom signal from the lunar far side marked the scientific triumph of Project Echo Zero, but it simultaneously triggered its immediate and comprehensive failure in the geopolitical arena. The doctrine of obscurity, the systematic burial of the mission and its findings, was not a function of incompetence, but of deliberate, high-level strategic quarantine. Dr. Alistair Finch, the theoretical architect, understood that the signal's data, the unnervingly stable frequency emanating from the uninhabited null zone, was not merely evidence of a scientific anomaly, it was proof of a non-terrestrial, stable energy source. The political consequence of this information in the fraught atmosphere of 1968 was immediate and terrifying. The immediate quarantine. The process of shutting down Project Echo Zero was swift, silent, and entirely non-negotiable. It began hours after Dr. Finch presented his preliminary findings to a clandestine oversight committee composed not of NASA directors, but of personnel from the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, and the National Security Council, NSC. The official narrative recorded in the Treasury's zero-sum file that the mission failed due to scheduling conflicts was the final surgical lie. The reality was a rapid implementation of the doctrine of obscurity, a three-pronged strategy designed to eliminate the project's footprint and insulate the White House from the discovery. Personnel dissipation. Dr. Finch was immediately transferred out of the NBS facility and reassigned to a low-level academic post at a remote university, researching theoretical thermal mechanics, a field entirely divorced from acoustics or space. Mr. Samuel Pierce, the logistical architect, was quietly returned to his civil service position at the Air Force Materials Command, with his work redacted from all efficiency reports. The small team of ground technicians was immediately dispersed to various non-related projects across the country. The order was simple: do not communicate, do not publish, and do not acknowledge the existence of the AS1 unit or the resulting data. The paper trail eradication. The destruction of all auxiliary documentation was paramount. The original purchase order for the cryogenic isolation unit was systematically purged from all physical inventory logs. The final budget closeout, the zero-sum file, was executed with surgical precision, designed to be boring and correct enough to survive routine audits, but reveal nothing. The deliberate act of creating a zero-sum anomaly ensured that the only evidence of the $20,000 expenditure was the perfectly balanced, unquestionable final ledger. Data isolation. The original magnetic tape containing the phantom signal was not destroyed. Destruction would imply panic. Instead, the tape was cataloged under a new deceptive identification number: Lunar Seismology Trial Data, High Noise Floor, TS811, and locked away in a non-accessible DIA vault, filed among millions of similarly dull, unusable intelligence reports. It was hidden not by a deep cover operation, but by being classified as useless academic noise. The geopolitical panic, the unspoken fear.
The decision to impose the doctrine of obscurity was driven by a single unspoken fear: escalation through ambiguity. In 1968, the détente between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was precarious. The discovery of an unknown non-terrestrial energy source on the Moon would have been interpreted by military strategists not as a scientific breakthrough, but as a secret third-party military installation, or worse, a highly sophisticated Soviet camouflage operation designed to test American intelligence capabilities in the ULF spectrum. The NSC reasoned that if the U.S. announced the discovery, the Soviets would interpret it as a deliberate provocation, a clear signal that the U.S. had already developed secret sensitive ULF detection capabilities far beyond what was officially admitted. This could have triggered an immediate aggressive escalation in the military space race, potentially jeopardizing the entire Apollo program and pushing the two nations toward open conflict over the Moon. The analysis was cold. Better to pretend the signal does not exist than to risk a cosmic Cuban Missile Crisis. The scientists' compliance. Dr. Finch, the intellectual father of the mission, was faced with the ultimate moral and professional dilemma: the pursuit of truth versus the stability of the world. His compliance with the doctrine of obscurity was purchased not with money, but with the chilling presentation of intelligence reports detailing the fragile balance of power and the projected catastrophic outcomes of public disclosure. He accepted the deep silence, recognizing that the very nature of the signal, its mathematical perfection, and its unlisted source was too great a burden for the unstable world of the late 1960s. He became a self-imposed prisoner of his own discovery, forced to carry the truth in his memory while publicly pursuing academic irrelevance. Project Echo Zero failed because it succeeded too well. The architects of quietude proved that the Moon held a profound secret. The government, terrified by the implications, chose strategic blindness. The mission was aborted, the records were falsified, and the data was buried under the thickest form of camouflage: official boredom. The next chapter will delve into the personal cost of this forced silence, tracing the psychological burden carried by Dr. Finch and the final quiet act of defiance he enacted to ensure the secret would survive his own mandated historical obscurity.
The immediate imposition of the doctrine of obscurity fundamentally reshaped the life of Dr. Alistair Finch. Reassigned to a remote academic post, the theoretical architect of Project Echo Zero found himself exiled not by geography, but by knowledge. He was forced to watch the triumphant final years of the Apollo program unfold, knowing that the greatest secret of the lunar environment, the rhythmic 0.35 Hz phantom signal, was actively being ignored in favor of the visible, public spectacle of moon rocks and flag planting. Dr. Finch's silence was absolute, professional, and ultimately profoundly unsustainable. The intellectual burden of carrying such a destabilizing truth, a constant rhythmic heartbeat from the void, became his defining, hidden struggle. The silence of the archive had been transferred to the silence of the man. Dr. Elias Vance's contemporary investigation into the defunct Echo Zero project had successfully traced the financial anomalies and the personnel dispersal, but the true analytical heart of the mission, Dr. Finch's complete interpretation of the signal, remained elusive. Finch, following his imposed protocol, never published, spoke, or wrote a single line about the AS-1 unit or the resulting data. However, the final crucial clue was discovered not in a federal archive, but in the quiet domestic inventory of Dr. Finch's estate following his peaceful death in the late 1990s. Among his meager personal belongings was a collection of his professional papers transferred to his university's library decades ago.
Within this collection, buried inside a box labeled Thermal Dynamics Course Notes 1978-1980, was a single, non-standard, pocket-sized volume, the missing logbook. The logbook of the null zone. The logbook was not a diary nor a formal government document. It was a personal, hard-backed notebook bound in plain, deep green cloth, its pages filled with Dr. Finch's meticulous, tiny handwriting. It was clearly carried everywhere, its cover softened by years of friction in a coat pocket, its edges stained by coffee and ink. The early pages contained conventional academic notes, lectures on thermodynamics, calculations for heat transfer, and mundane office schedules. But starting on a specific non-dated page near the center, the tone shifted abruptly. The entries became exclusively focused on the Echo Zero data, written in a dense, private shorthand designed to be intelligible to anyone unfamiliar with his unique scientific notation. The purpose of the logbook became clear. It was Dr. Finch's quiet act of defiance against the doctrine of obscurity. He knew he could not publish the truth, but he could ensure the methodology of discovery survived his enforced silence, preserving the integrity of his work for a future generation capable of understanding it. The logbook contained two major critical revelations: the code for the noise floor. Dr. Finch documented the precise calibration procedures of the AS-1 unit, detailing how the cryogenic cooling was used to establish the acoustic null of the lunar environment. He included a key, a series of nonlinear differential equations that could filter out all known terrestrial and cosmic noise from the raw TS-811 tape, the DIA file name for the phantom signal data. The interpretation of perfection. The later pages contained Dr. Finch's deepest analytical conclusion regarding the 0.35 Hz signal. He did not call it seismic or magnetic. He consistently referred to it as the prime harmonic, a term rooted in his theoretical work on the universe's fundamental quietude. His final entry, written in a particularly cramped hand and dated simply Winter 1979, summarized his life's quiet tragedy. They demanded silence for security. I gave them silence, but I preserved the method. The signal is not a weapon nor a threat. It is an organizational truth. The perfection of the harmonic proves the presence of a structure designed to endure the universe. My duty now is not to report, but to ensure that when the world is ready, the data can be heard cleanly. The moon speaks, and its language is geometry, not noise. The final act of preservation. Dr. Finch's decision to hide the logbook within his most boring and unremarkable professional papers mirrored the government's own use of obscurity. He wrapped the logbook in a dull manila folder, ensured it was labeled with tedious course notes, and let it sit undisturbed for 20 years. Its survival was guaranteed by its utter banality. The logbook was protected by the very silence that had been imposed upon its author. Dr. Vance, upon finding the logbook, spent months meticulously decoding Dr. Finch's shorthand and mathematical language, a process requiring an immersion into Dr. Finch's singular quiet genius. This slow, methodical decoding was the ultimate scholarly pilgrimage, a conversation across time between two silent historians. The logbook not only provided the key to unlocking the raw data tape, TS-811, still locked away in the DIA vault, but also delivered the scientist's final moral injunction. The signal must be understood through the lens of geometry and endurance, not through fear or military strategy. Dr. Finch's silence was broken only to ensure the integrity of the truth survived the pressure of the Cold War. The existence of the logbook confirmed that the secrecy surrounding Project Echo Zero was not total. The intelligence community successfully silenced the man, but the man quietly ensured the survival of the method. The narrative now moves to the geopolitical context that forced this silence, the unseen international pressure, and the whispered treaties that ensured the moon remained, officially, a silent partner in the cosmos.
The enforced silence of Dr. Alistair Finch and the subsequent deep burial of the phantom signal data, logged as TS-811, were not isolated acts of paranoia by the U.S. government. They were the visible consequence of a pervasive international understanding, a chilling realization that quietly guided the actions of both the Soviet Union and the United States throughout the latter half of the space race. This understanding, never committed to any public document, became known within certain closed circles as the Unspoken Treaty. Dr. Elias Vance's investigation, now armed with the keys to the data from Finch's logbook, delved into the geopolitical currents of the mid-1960s, seeking the historical context that could justify such a catastrophic suppression of scientific truth. His research bypassed public treaties and focused on the obscure records of diplomatic back channels, State Department cipher logs, and specialized military attachés. The doctrine of planetary non-interference. The formal agreements governing space exploration, such as the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, publicly barred nations from placing weapons of mass destruction in orbit and asserted the freedom of exploration. However, beneath this public facade existed the Unspoken Treaty, a mutual, tacit agreement rooted in a shared, profound anxiety: planetary non-interference. The two superpowers, consumed by their rivalry, had achieved a silent, logical convergence. Neither side could afford to have the other claim an extraterrestrial discovery of such magnitude, especially one pointing to a non-terrestrial intelligence, as it would instantly create a massive, permanent strategic imbalance. Therefore, both nations silently agreed that should any data prove the existence of an organized, non-human presence in the solar system, the information must be immediately suppressed and treated as a mutual existential secret. The Soviet parallel to Project Echo Zero, Dr. Vance discovered, was likely Project Zveno, Link, a low-profile acoustic monitoring initiative launched on an early unmanned lunar flyby in 1966. Zveno was officially declared a failure of power coupling. However, highly redacted U.S. intercepts confirmed Zveno's real objective was identical to Echo Zero's, measuring the lunar far side's acoustic noise floor. The Soviets, too, were listening for the quiet hum. The pressure to implement the doctrine of obscurity on Echo Zero came to a head when preliminary, low-resolution data from the AS-1 unit, prior to Finch's full analysis, was intercepted and analyzed by Soviet intelligence. The Soviets, familiar with the ULF spectrum and their own Zveno results, immediately recognized the 0.35 Hz signature as a confirmation of their own, equally terrifying, quiet discovery. The critical phase began with a series of obscure, high-level diplomatic meetings in neutral European capitals, disguised as talks concerning obscure trade agreements or cultural exchanges. These were the true negotiation points of the Unspoken Treaty. The essence of the negotiation, gleaned by Dr. Vance from highly compartmentalized, decoded U.S. diplomatic cables, was chillingly simple. The U.S. tacitly acknowledged Soviet knowledge of the anomaly, and the Soviets tacitly acknowledged U.S. capability to detect it. The mutual condition for the continuation of the public space race, Apollo versus Soyuz, was the mutual denial of the phantom signal. The Soviets had also discovered the signal, silenced their own scientists, and accepted the existential ambiguity of the null zone. Their agreement with the U.S. was not about power sharing, but about risk mitigation,
the shared realization that the discovery was too large for either ideology to contain. The Cold War echo was therefore not a clash of ideologies, but a sudden, terrifying moment of convergence where both superpowers looked into the same silent abyss and decided in chilling synchronicity to close the door and pretend they saw nothing. The true cost of silence. The unspoken treaty meant that every subsequent mission to the moon, both American and Soviet, was carried out under the umbrella of profound historical deception. The astronauts, the flight controllers, and the public were led to believe the lunar surface was geologically cold and silent, while the highest echelons of government knew of the rhythmic, organized pulse radiating from the null zone. The cost of this treaty was paid by the quiet suffering of men like Dr. Finch, whose intellectual purpose was invalidated for strategic necessity. Their lives became the human collateral damage of the unspoken treaty. Dr. Vance's final analysis of this historical juncture was slow and contemplative. The doctrine of obscurity was designed to keep the moon secret from the world, but to keep the phantom signal secret from the Cold War itself. The goal was to preserve the stability of the Earth, even at the cost of galactic truth. The only way to validate Dr. Finch's tragic life and break the enduring seal of the unspoken treaty is now to use his logbook and the computational keys to retrieve and analyze the buried data itself. The time has come to see if the phantom signal survived its quarantine, and if modern technology can finally reveal the purpose of the persistent, organized silence on the moon.
The burden of the unspoken treaty and the subsequent doctrine of obscurity successfully insulated the 0.35 Hz phantom signal for decades. The original raw data tape, TS-811, remained locked in a high-security vault designated as unusable noise. Dr. Alistair Finch's logbook, the key to unlocking the signal, lay dormant in a dusty academic collection. The truth was protected by silence and bureaucratic indifference. However, the nature of a profound scientific anomaly is that it rarely disappears. It persists, manifesting as a subtle, persistent legacy of static in subsequent publicly funded research. Dr. Elias Vance's mission was now clear: to move the inquiry from the history of secrecy to the realm of modern satellite confirmation. Armed with the computational keys from Finch's logbook, Vance could retroactively analyze the vast, declassified datasets collected by later, more sophisticated lunar orbiters, searching for the telltale ULF signature that had been systematically filtered out by conventional noise reduction protocols. The search in the noise floor. The key to the modern confirmation lay in the standard operating procedure, SOP, of early 21st century lunar missions. All satellite data, particularly from missions involving highly sensitive magnetometers and gravitational sensors, is subjected to rigorous filtering to remove noise. This noise includes expected magnetic fields, thermal radiation, and ultra-low frequency interference below 1 Hz, which is typically attributed to instrumental drift or non-anomalous background static. Dr. Vance theorized that the 0.35 Hz phantom signal, having been categorized as unusable noise in 1968, was still being categorized and filtered out in the 2000s. The legacy of the static was the consistency of the filtering. Vance focused on the raw, unfiltered telemetry data from 2 key modern NASA missions: Lunar Prospector, 1998 to 1999, designed to map the lunar surface composition and magnetism; GRAIL, Gravity Recovery and Interior Laboratory, 2011 to 2012, designed to create a highly accurate gravitational field map;
The datasets for these missions were massive, requiring years of processing time. Dr. Vance, applying the complex nonlinear differential equations derived from Dr. Finch's logbook, developed a highly specialized algorithm, an inverse filter, designed to reintroduce the specific frequency range that the SOP had consistently purged. The confirmation of the null zone. The result of the inverse filtering was slow, methodical, and chillingly conclusive. When the 0.35 Hz frequency was reintroduced to the unfiltered data, a clear, persistent anomaly emerged in both the prospector's magnetometer readings and the Grail gravitational data. Magnetometer anomaly. The prospector data, when unfiltered, showed a rhythmic fluctuation in the local magnetic field precisely at 0.35 Hz when the probe was over the null zone. This was not a steady field or an instantaneous spike. It was a rhythmic pulse of organized energy, confirming the persistent, non-random nature of the 1968 signal. Gravitational anomaly. The Grail data, designed to measure minute variations in gravity, showed a corresponding localized, subtle stress oscillation in the gravitational field over the same null zone coordinates. The pulse was tiny, but perfectly synchronized with the calculated 0.35 Hz period. The crucial finding was the consistency across decades. The signal was not a temporary artifact of the 1960s. It was an enduring, stable characteristic of the lunar far side's acoustic environment. The legacy of the static confirms that the phantom signal is real, persistent, and organized. The rhythmic beat remains active, a constant, quiet hum in the vacuum. The final chapter must now address the most fundamental question. If the signal is not seismic, not magnetic, and not human, American or Soviet, then what is the source of the organized silence on the far side? The investigation must now confront the true, profound implications of this extraterrestrial quiet.
The conclusion of the inquiry into Project Echo Zero is not the triumphant answer to a riddle, but the chilling realization that the riddle itself is one of fundamental, cosmological significance. Dr. Elias Vance's work, spanning the zero-sum file of 1968, the decoding of Dr. Alistair Finch's logbook, and the modern satellite confirmation of the persistent 0.35 Hz rhythm, has successfully validated the existence of the phantom signal. The signal is real, it is stable, and it emanates from the geologically cold, silent null zone of the lunar far side. The final question facing the historian and the scientist is the most profound. What is the source of the organized quiet? The rejection of terrestrial logic. The sheer mathematical consistency of the pulse forces the rejection of all known terrestrial and solar explanations. The 0.35 Hz frequency is the sound of absolute order, a tone that violates the chaotic nature of all known planetary formation. No seismic event. Moonquakes dissipate, they do not maintain perfect, sustained amplitude for over 50 years. No stellar event. Solar flares or deep space radio bursts are intermittent and exhibit Doppler or plasma scattering effects. No human technology known. No American or Soviet asset launched in the 1960s possessed the energy source, the thermal isolation, or the sustained operational capacity to run for 5 decades in cryogenic silence. Furthermore, no nation would run a powerful ULF beacon on the far side without also creating high-frequency communication signals, which are entirely absent from the acoustic record. The signal's stability forced Dr. Vance to embrace Dr. Finch's ultimate intellectual leap. The signal is an organizational truth, a function of structured engineering.
The final analysis, conducted by Dr. Vance in the sterile, quiet environment of his computational lab, centered on the prime harmonic itself, the perfect, slow pulse. The frequency of 0.35 Hertz translates to approximately 1 complete cycle every 2.85 seconds. It is a rhythm that is slow, deep, and deeply stable. Dr. Vance theorized that this pulse represents not a transmission, but the operation of a primary energy stabilizer, a device designed for maximum longevity and minimal power output. The energy consumption of such a slow cycle pulse would be minuscule, guaranteeing operation for geological timeframes. The ULF nature of the signal reinforces its function as a silent footprint. If a massive, complex operation, be it an energy source, a communications relay, or a defensive structure, were running deep beneath the far side, its fundamental power regulation would occur at a very low cycle. The 0.35 Hertz tone is the hum of the foundation, the deep rhythmic beat of a machine designed to be permanent, using the granite of the moon itself as an insulator against thermal and acoustic detection. The final null is the profound irony of the discovery. The quietest place in the solar system contains the most perfectly organized sound, a testament to an unseen engineering marvel that requires only the absence of atmosphere and noise to be heard. The enduring mystery of extraterrestrial quiet continues to pulse, slow and steady, beneath the cold, watchful eye of the moon.